Hello, this is Professor Hasselman in History 107, World History. And today we're going to be talking about the world economy again. And this time we're going to be talking about some change and continuity that developed during the 20th and the 21st centuries. Now, one of the frameworks for world history from the early modern period onward has been the unequal relationships in world trade. The dominance of the industrial West in the long 19th century was a crucial factor for literally every society in the world. In the contemporary period, elements of the now traditional world economy persisted. The basic definition of the core economy survived, though now with primary emphasis on high tech, service, and entertainment products. Peripheral or dependent economies dotted the landscape. The increasing peripheralization of much of Africa was a key development during the 20th century, and the addition of Japan and the Pacific Rim in the list of core economies was another crucial development. Another change was intriguing though shorter lived. At various points in the mid 20th century, a variety of societies sought to escape the world economy, setting up separate economic zones. This was an interesting comment on the downside of the world economy previously, but also on some increase in the latitude available to escape Western domination. The most important general shift, marking a new stage in the evolution of the world economy, was the capacity of many societies to gain some relief from the worst inferiorities of the world economy and introduce new sources of profit. This process began in the 1920s, but reached fuller fruition toward the end of the century. From Brazil to China, a number of countries also included in an undifferentiated third world status managed, without achieving full equality with the core, to become major international players. Forecasts suggested that this trend would continue into the global future. The world economy reveals both continuity and change in world history between the long 19th century and the contemporary era. One might think that the economy is an area where continuity predominates. Core economies and peripheries, for example, still exist. The term third world in some ways seems to enshrine continuity. Over time, this term came to refer to parts of the world that were not industrialized and were vastly poorer than the first world. The world economy itself concept, as enunciated by Wallerstein, was meant to enshrine persistence. Wallerstein's theory was that the origins of the fatal economic gaps that persisted in the contemporary world could be found in the early modern period and the 19th century. Core characteristics can still be identified in the 21st century in much of Western Europe and the United States. These societies still export expensive goods and import cheaper goods using trading companies based in the core. They rely on wage labor and have, for the most part, stable governments. Their goods, however, have changed. They now export professional services and many entertainment staples. A few societies did not display core characteristics in terms of export-import, but managed to maintain fairly high standards of living. These societies fit a semi-core definition. Canada, for example, was a leading raw materials and food supplier to the United States, and Australia, by the later 20th century, was the leading raw materials supplier to Japan. Peripheries were still characterized by relatively weak governments and continued to export cheap goods such as lower-level manufactured products, and some of the locations of the periphery shifted. Peripheral societies still existed in Latin America and Central America, where cheap factory products and drugs were exported. The key periphery during the contemporary period, however, could be found in sub-Saharan Africa, where food supplies, raw materials, and mining supplies were the predominant exports. Although Africa had been colonized by the end of the long 19th century, it was only in the 20th century that its economy was converted more fully to peripheral status by the operations of colonial powers. The most striking shift in the contemporary period was the entry into the core of Japan, followed by other parts of the Pacific Rim, including South Korea and Taiwan. This development modified the association of the core with the West. Thus, when we think about the relative decline of the West, we must consider the fact that Western Europe's monopoly over core status was qualified by the addition of parts of East Asia. A second cultural zone was now capable of advanced industrialization and participation in the core. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan imitated Western countries in many respects, but they maintained a Confucian emphasis on group loyalty, group values, collective decision making, and close relationships between the state and the private sector. Earlier patterns seem to be persistent in the contemporary period. Some societies still reap disproportionate benefits from world trade, while some labor under disadvantages. The only things that seem to have changed are the geography, some of the entrants in both camps, and the specific goods exchanged. This emphasis on persistence, however, misses the clear beginnings of efforts to move away from the world economic framework in several ways. Beginning early in the 20th century, a number of societies saw that the world economy was not working to their benefit. They needed to establish their own market frameworks that would release them from dependence on global economic relationships. The first country that came to this realization was Russia, where the doctrine of socialism under Stalin proclaimed that the Soviet Union could industrialize without significant contact with the rest of the world. Soviet economic growth, however, came at the cost of low wages and social frustration and environmental damage. In the 1960s, China attempted a similar isolation. After the Communist Revolution was completed in 1949, China's industrialization was meant to proceed in conjunction with the Soviet Unions. Later, however, China moved towards an even more isolationist policy. As World War II neared, Japanese attempts to establish relationships with the colonial sphere in the East and Southeast Asia represented another effort at partial economic isolation. Japan envisioned what it called the co-prosperity sphere, in which a set of countries would trade with Japan in unequal relationships. Nazi Germany, to some extent, also sought to separate itself from the world economy. The goal was for Germany to set up a colonial relationship with the agricultural regions of Eastern Europe, and again launch a mini world economy in which German industrial might was supported by cheap exports from the Slavic hinterland. This interlude is echoed even in the 21st century by small cases of economic isolation, most notably in North Korea. By the later 20th century, most of the societies that had tried the go-it-alone policy had concluded that it was a mistake, and one by one rejoined the world economy. The more durable efforts to adjust to the world economy in ways that complicate the core periphery relationships fall into several categories. Peripheral societies are categorized by low-wage economies, a small capitalist class, and intense pressure for more sophisticated exports. Elements of peripheralization in the sense of low-wage export sectors still exist in the economies we will discuss. The first method used to help countries climb out of peripheralization was the policy of import substitution initiated in the 1920s. Under this policy, the government, working with private entrepreneurs, sets up production of some essential but less sophisticated industrial products such as textiles, automobiles, and basic appliances. And these products then no longer have to be imported from the core. This move does not totally break the core periphery relationship, but it reduces the importation of expensive items. Import substitution is also usually accompanied by protective tariffs. Many economists question the long-term utility of these measures, but in the short run, they can help moderate dependency. Latin American countries suffering from the Great Depression moved towards import substitution in the mid to late 1930s. India would adopt measures of import substitution after it achieved independence in 1947. The goods produced for import substitution were not necessarily of as high quality as those produced by the core, but these products satisfied part of the local demand and reduced economic pressure. Another method used to escape peripheralization was to seize on one particular good that was either valuable or could be produced in newly efficient ways and translated into exports. The most obvious case in point here is Middle Eastern oil, initially a peripheral product. When Western companies controlled the supply, oil was essentially a cheap product. Once independence was achieved by major Middle Eastern and North African nations after World War II, however, political measures could be used to seize control of the oil and make it a very profitable export. This is what happened in the Gulf states in the decades since the 1950s. Other products could be used as well. Chile, for example, by the 1970s and 80s, was breaking out of the peripheral trap by emphasizing vegetable and fruit production for U.S. markets. The third method to break out of peripheralization was to develop a few sectors in which an economy could begin to compete with the core by exporting processed goods on a worldwide basis. Brazil, for example, negotiated with the United States during World War II for the provision of a modern steel industry in return for American use of Brazilian observation posts. The Brazilians also became aware of the military implications of the computer industry fairly early, and the government began to sponsor investments in computers. The Brazilian economy continues to have pockets of poverty in many peripheral industries and agricultural sectors, but it has moved out of an easily definable category. By the 1900s, the early years of the 21st century, the big stories in export sectors were, of course, China and India. China became almost literally the workshop of the world. Wages were low and workers were exploited, but the capacity to produce textiles, electronics, gifts, and other basic goods makes it impossible now to define China as a peripheral economy. India's transformation involved less emphasis on global manufacturing and more on the development of service industries. A host of societies, by using one or more of these innovative methods, have thus complicated their categorization in the world economy. The contemporary period continues elements inherited from the long 19th century, but it puts its own stamp on these patterns. By the later 20th and early 21st centuries, we see that some economists are calling the industrialization of the world. In the late 20th century, about 20% of the world's population was actively involved in industrial economies. This number has jumped to 60% in the early 21st century. The inequalities of economic relationships among different parts of the world is not gone. By the 21st century, the key issues were not so much among the regions as within them, generated by the process of partial industrialization and import substitution. So this is the end of today's lecture on the New World economy starting in the 20th century, and a discussion of some of the changes and some of the continuities that still exist after the long 19th century.